If you were growing up around church, you probably came across the song, Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. And really that's reflective of the biblical truth that Abraham is the father of all who believe. And if he's the father of all who believe, apart from works, as Paul says in Romans chapter 4, then it's a good question to ask, what did Abraham believe? Or we could ask it a little bit differently, what is the gospel according to Abraham? When we think about studying the life of Abraham and the gospel according to Abraham, the most essential thing to grasp is that Genesis 17 is after Genesis chapter 15. Paul makes a really big deal about this in Romans chapter 4. In Genesis chapter 12, God said to Abraham that he was going to bless Abraham, or Abram at this time, and that he was going to make him into a blessing. So he was going to be the object of God's blessing, and he was also going to be the instrument of God's blessing. When we get to Genesis chapter 15, the focus there is on how God will be blessing Abraham, how Abraham will be blessed by God. And it begins with talking about the seed. At this time, Abram is childless. His wife, Sarah, is barren, and God promises to him that he will have the seed as numerous, or descendants as numerous as the stars of the heavens. And it says in Genesis 15, chapter 6, that Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, as that passage continues, then it talks about the land. So the blessings that are isolated in chapter 15 are that God will bless Abram with both a seed and with a land. Now, it's only until we get to Genesis chapter 17 that we get the rite of circumcision. And this is when he receives a covenant sign or a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith. That's based on the language that Paul uses in Romans chapter 4, verse 11. So what's going on there is that Paul makes a big point about how Genesis chapter 15 precedes Genesis chapter 17. Of course, he doesn't use that terminology, but that's precisely what he's talking about in Romans chapter 4. He says that the gospel is in the fact, or justification by faith, apart from works, is in that section of Scripture. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, he believes God, and it is credited to him as righteousness. And it's only after that he receives the sign of circumcision. And so Paul says that this is really, really important for understanding the gospel. He says, if 17 was before 15, then Abram would have a work, and he would only be the father of those who had been circumcised. But because 15, justification by faith apart from works, precedes Genesis chapter 17, Paul says that Abram is the father of all who believe, whether circumcised or uncircumcised. So already we see in the early chapters of Genesis chapter 15, Genesis chapter 17, the relationship of the gospel and the teaching of justification by faith.